And we have an outstanding program this morning of a great panel here and who are going to try and cover a lot of ground and try and highlight for us how an infrastructure bank could work from a variety of different perspectives. Or perhaps they're going to kick the tires and say, you know, there are other pieces of this that really need to be thought. I want to quickly recognize the fact that there are a lot of folks on various websites, including The Atlantic, the Washington Note, which I run, watching live, so we have various people participating on the outside as well. Without further ado, let me introduce my colleague and great friend and partner, Michael Hirsh, Chief Correspondent of National Journal. Of course, we knew him at Newsweek. He's written the best book on kind of, I would call it, if you really want to have a page-turner on DC structural corruption in the economic area. Capital Offense is out there. Buy it, get it. It's on Amazon. He did not ask me to say it. I really, really love that book. So without further ado, the chairman of this panel is Michael Hirsh. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thanks so much, Steve, for the unrequested shout out for the book. Probably I'm hardly the only book author here, so you're all aware of how much that means. Without further ado, let's get to the subject at hand. There's no question of the need for a dramatic attention to America's crumbling infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that under current plans, there would still be some $2.2 trillion worth of improvements needed for the nation's roads, bridges, waterways, which are failing. Additional attention has been brought to this issue because of the perceived competition from abroad. Countries like China and Japan and the European countries, which are seemingly doing a better job of investing in their infrastructure. And the issue comes to our attention at a time when Washington's almost exclusive focus is on cutting spending. The Democratic approach has been to say, let's invest, education, infrastructure, but the Republican response has been that's just another Democratic code word for spending, and we don't want to do that. Now, in the middle of this, we have had a couple of interesting proposals, one of which was just introduced in March by Senators Kerry, Mark Warner, and Kay Bailey Hutchinson on the Republican side to create a national infrastructure bank. It has the very distinctive and I would say extremely rare in this environment quality of having been supported both by the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO. And that's what we're going to discuss today with really a remarkable panel of experts, beginning with on my immediate, pardon me, seem to be lacking, here we go, on my immediate right, Brian Pallasch, who's the Managing Director for Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiative at the American Society of Civil Engineers, whose study I just cited. To his right, Tyler Duvall, Associate Principal with McKinsey, and a former acting Undersecretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation, Michael Likosky, Director of the Center on Law and Public Finance, the Social Science Research Council, former and a current senior fellow at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge. He's the author of 5 books, including one called Obama's Bank, Financing a Durable New Deal. Robert Dove, Managing Director of the Carlyle Group, former Senior Vice President of Bechtel, and the Financing, Development, and Investment Unit of Bechtel Group. And Sherle Schwenninger, who is the director for the Economic Growth Program and the co-director of the Smart Globalization Initiative at the New America Foundation. He's also a co-founder of the New America Foundation and a co-author with Bernard Schwartz, one of our sponsors today, of an economic recovery program for the post-bubble economy. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn to speak for several minutes and either make the case for or against the idea of the National Infrastructure Bank, whether it's the one embodied in the bill I just mentioned or some other version of it, or whether there should be some alternative approach to dealing with our infrastructure problem. Mr. Pallasch?
Thank you. I think I'll start by setting the stage and giving you some of the numbers that ASCE is rather well known for. As a nation, we cannot thrive economically or socially without the solid foundation of well-performing infrastructure systems, whether they be surface transportation, water resources, energy. But for decades, we've allowed those systems to crumble, not only through inattention, but also underinvestment. In 2009, as I think you're all aware, and I appreciate the plug, ASCE's report card gave the nation a grade of D. And we noted that we needed to spend about $2.2 trillion to get the grades up to what we call a B level. Some of us maybe want a little bit better than that, but a B is pretty good. I'm happy when my kids bring home a B from school. And by our calculations, at least the calculations before this desire to spend less money, we felt that through the next 5 years, starting in 2009, that the federal, state, and local governments would spend about $1 trillion to $1.1 trillion of that $2.2 trillion. So we have a little ways to go to get to that B. And if we look at some of the things more specifically, we still are faced in this country with 26% of our bridges that are functionally obsolete or structurally deficient. We're supposed to be spending to get rid of that backlog about $17 billion a year to fix our nation's bridges, to get rid of that backlog. We only spend about $10.5 billion a year. We as Americans spend 34 hours a year stuck in traffic. Not only does that cost us time, but you can calculate that in terms of money, and it's about $115 billion wasted every year, not only in gas but in time. That's about $800 per motorist. Not to mention the cost of the conditions. If you run over a big pothole in your car and you break your axle or pop a tire, that's at $67 billion. But really at this point, from all levels of government, we're only spending about $70 billion a year on capital improvements to the nation's infrastructure system. And depending on whose estimates you use, we should be spending about $180 billion. And there's a bunch of estimates, but $180 billion would get you close to that B grade. We've got transit use, where that seems to increase greatly when we pay $4 a gallon for gas. But as we all know, certainly in the Washington area, our transit systems need more investment as well. The escalators don't work, the cars are getting old, and that needs more work as well. Drinking water and wastewater, that's sort of the unseen infrastructure. We're lucky enough to have clean water every day, but we do lose a good deal of water every day that's treated. 7 billion gallons of clean and treated water are lost every day to water main breaks. No one's been able to really put a cost on that, but that's an expensive cost because it does cost money to treat water. We face an annual shortfall in drinking water in terms of the investment levels of $11 billion a year to replace those aging systems. And that's an EPA estimate, and that doesn't account for any growth. And we know from demographers that we'll have another 100 million people in this country in the next 20 to 30 years. Communities are trying to search for new ways to deal with these problems. In Orange County, they actually have a groundwater replenishment system which takes highly treated sewage water and puts it back into aquifers so that eventually someday it will come back into the drinking water system. Another thing that remains rather vulnerable, and I think we're seeing it right now, is our water resources infrastructure. We've witnessed this spring the largest floods since the 1930s, and the levees are basically right now just holding. We don't have a good sense of where all the levees are. We're probably finding a few more of them today because they're holding back some of the water. We think there's about 100,000 miles of levees in this country. We haven't done a good inventory of those levees, if we actually went about the process of trying to repair and replace some of those levees, we're talking probably close to $100 billion, and there's no source of funds for that activity. The risk to public health and safety from failures has increased, and it's not just New Orleans that's at risk. We've seen cities all up and down the Mississippi River who are at risk today from levees failing. In addition to that, if you're not aware, Sacramento, California is ringed by levees, and if those levees fail, not only do the people in Sacramento have problems, but the people in Los Angeles have problems because their drinking water becomes contaminated with salt water as a result of the levee failures. I know this is a rather bleak picture, but I have to say, as a nation, we have to stop asking whether or not we can afford to invest in these critical systems by increasing our funding. We have to start asking ourselves how we can afford not to. So it's not really a question of can we afford it, it's we must afford it. I think as a nation we deserve better than to settle for failing infrastructure. Our future prosperity depends on an immediate and long-term commitment of both resources and leadership to rebuilding the nation's infrastructure systems. We commend the senators who have introduced the BUILD Act for putting their efforts behind bringing attention to the nation's infrastructure crisis. And we call on all the leaders, both in Congress and in the White House and in agencies and at the state and local level, to start coming up with better solutions and start solving these problems. I'd also like to note that that innovative financing is not really a replacement for funding. The Infrastructure Bank is a tremendous first step forward, and it's gotten us to be discussing a lot more about how we invest more creatively in our infrastructure. We support these kinds of initiatives about innovative financing programs, and we think it's going to be an important tool in that toolbox, to use an overused phrase. But the federal government should make additional efforts to develop new programs, not only financing programs, but funding programs. And the bank is one of the ways to do that. We think the bank should be capitalized initially by general fund appropriations and should hopefully be self-sustaining in the near term, that it should develop financing packages for selected projects and would create some sort of a mechanism to pick good projects, if you will, and it should have performance measures for those projects. We should not replace existing infrastructure funding and financing mechanisms just because we have an infrastructure bank, but it should act as a supplement and be leveraged to federal, state, and local and private infrastructure financing. So with that, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you. Mr. Duvall?
Great, thanks. So I work for a really large consulting firm. We don't take official policy positions. We provide analytics, and it's very painful for me to have to admit that, given I spent 7 years doing federal policy. So I'm not going to take an official position on the bank. I'm actually just going to bring some lessons from previous life helping run the largest infrastructure finance vehicle at the federal level at the Department of Transportation, and then also kind of reflect on some of these fundamental problems that Brian just talked about, which I think are pretty relevant to the discussion. So when thinking about kind of structuring an infrastructure finance vehicle, I think that some of the important lessons kind of over the last 10 years out of the TIFIA program at the U.S. Department of Transportation are pretty relevant to the discussion you're having today. First and foremost, I think you need certainty. You need certainty across two dimensions. You need certainty of criteria, and you need certainty of funding. The current TIFIA program is subject to the exact same appropriations process, obviously, that everything else in the federal government, not on the mandatory side, is subject to. That provides a lot of uncertainty on a day-to-day basis to administer the program. Every time the budget cycle comes around, you have a queue of borrowers that is simply waiting, obviously, for this appropriation. Huge amount of pent-up capital that obviously doesn't get deployed in that circumstance. For about the first 10 years of that program, there was so much excess lending capacity that the question of criteria was largely irrelevant. The department did not need to decide which types of projects were good projects, which types of ones were bad ones. Basically, if you had a project that needed some credit assistance, we could provide it, assuming you could meet some basic credit thresholds. If you could, meet debt service coverage ratios, you're good to go. That changed precipitously, basically in the 06, 07, 08 timeframe, and now there is a queue of projects that's substantial, huge amount of capital is waiting to be deployed through that program today. And for the first time ever, the program has actually needed to adopt some criteria. That has been a bit of a bumpy process because the policy reviews of obviously this administration, the previous administration, there are all these views that get into that process. There needs to be some certainty about what that criteria is. Borrowers need to know before they start to collect all the capital, deal with these big private equity funds like you hear about. They need to understand what the criteria is going to be for making these loan decisions. A very basic point, but the program has been a bit overrun, I think, by the surge in demand, which is a good indicator that credit assistance at the federal level is fundamental, part of the fundamental solution, not the whole one, which I'll talk about. But there needs to be an emphasis on criteria certainty. I know the legislation speaks to that, but a lot of the devil will be in the details and should not be left to later days. Subordination is a huge component, I think, both from a risk perspective and from attracting private sector lenders. At the end of the day, and I know that the current legislation that's being talked about a little bit has a 50% threshold for the project size. The presence of senior lenders outside the federal government who are actually on the hook for some of the risk of these projects is really fundamental. As good as the federal government can be at risk assessment, it's always great to have another set of eyes. And obviously we've had some pretty big failures at the federal level with respect to risk. And I think that is a core component of this program. There needs to be some real exposure from senior lenders who are asking really tough questions to potential borrowers. Related to subordination, I think, is basically the question of how quickly you can process. Bringing in another entity into the equation obviously complicates the loan process. Speed is really, really important, and so they're striking a balance between kind of employing lean processes without compromising risk, I think, is really part of the success, and that is the sweet spot. Right now, it's taking an extremely long time to process infrastructure loans at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Whether a new entity could come up with, there are better processes, whether a new entity could come up with those is a big question. And I would focus not simply on, what the criteria are, but what is the process to get to yes or no in a very timely fashion. This capital will flow elsewhere. There are a lot of projects around the globe that are basically ready to go. And if the United States is not able to basically expedite its decision processes across the board, frankly, but from permitting to loan processing decisions, you'll simply see capital go to other countries. I mean, the boom going on in Asia and South America right now is with legal certainty, by the way. I mean, there's a lot of sense that investing in these parts of the world is not legally certain. The procurement processes aren't good. That is changing as we speak. In fact, you're seeing some of the most sophisticated procurement processes in the world being installed in other countries, not in the United States. That will provide certainty, but it means there's a competition for capital that is brand new, and the U.S. Frankly needs to recognize. As Brian mentioned, though, the cost of finance or cost of capital is really only part of the overall infrastructure, failure in the U.S. If an entity like is being discussed today actually focused on reversing some of these more fundamental failures, it would actually have a really powerful effect. And the way we group these fundamental failures are on the operating, basically on the cost side, on the revenue side, and on the resource allocation side. Currently, the cost of delivering projects beyond the cost of capital itself is simply too high. We've seen flat or declining labor productivity in the U.S. 1 minute. I have 1 minute. Great. I'm going to wrap up. Okay. The labor productivity in the United States is flat or declining. The cost of operating is simply basically not matching what you've seen in other industrialized sectors. So we need to unleash a wave of basically innovation to drive down the long-term costs of infrastructure in the U.S., and the bank could focus on that. On the revenue side, it was noted we don't have a sustainable revenue mechanism for infrastructure. If you lower the cost of capital by 20%, you still have a problem that you need to generate revenues to finance those investments. We don't have a sustainable model. And lastly, the deployment of capital itself. Very few metrics used in the United States to deploy huge amounts of capital. Return on investment, which is used by every capital-intensive business in the world, is not used in the public sector to deploy capital. We don't see any performance metrics associated with that deployment. And again, at the end of the day, if those fundamental failures are not addressed, we will have a chronic infrastructure needs gap that will not be solved by reducing the cost of finance.
Thank you. Mr. Likosky?
Thanks. So I think I'm going to build on stuff that's been said, but maybe cut to the chase a little bit in my position or my view on the banks that are on the table, and then give some reason why. So I think our central challenge is to figure out ways of, in a time of deficit crisis, and it's not going to go away once the deficit ceiling gets taken care of, right? So we're going to be living with this for a while, and the fights around it, the perennial fights around it. How do we move away from fighting over pieces of a shrinking pie towards growing an economic pie? And infrastructure has a major role to play in this, and an infrastructure bank has a significant key role to play in finding ways to grow that infrastructure pie. And I think there's really 5 aspects of the Build Act of the American Infrastructure Finance Authority that I think are essential, regardless of how things move forward. I think are key aspects that have to be in a bank for it to be workable, in my view, and based upon a lot of experience, and I think others on the panel have experience working internationally and looking, why does the U.S. have a dysfunctional public-private partnership market, whereas it's fairly vibrant in other places? And I'd say one of the key reasons is everywhere in the world, including Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, benefits from an infrastructure bank of some sort. We just don't have that. And the characteristics of an infrastructure bank that I think are essential is, 1, this merit-based selection that we've been discussing. 2 is independence. So I think it has to be an independent entity, and I'll say something a little bit about that in a moment. Further, it has to be a multi-sector bank, and because we face a multi-sector crisis. We're not facing a single sector crisis. And there has to be some congressional role in the United States. I think we have to deal with some of the front-end political problems, front-end head-on. Otherwise we end up the situation we're in now, which we have difficulty closing projects, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons, and we have a very difficult time transitioning projects from one administration to another if there's a change of political party. So these are things that can only get solved by incorporating Congress has to play a key role in the bank, and the same thing has to happen at the state level. And then on the financing devices, a bank is going to be one part of the picture, and I think there's a few aspects that are represented in the financing authority that I think have to be key. I think there's a very strong case to be made for having only loans and loan guarantees in a bank. There's plenty of places for grants, and also further the discipline that comes with the need to become self-sustaining over time. I think the combination of that will affect the merit-based decision-making. And once again, it's not meant to cover everything, but there's a certain class of projects that, that this gets at. So what's the payoff for setting up a bank, and how does it address some of these underlying issues? Well, when public-private partnerships have been most effective, and when infrastructure banks have been most effective over the last 30 years, have been in countries that are facing severe budgetary crisis and have to find ways of bringing money into the infrastructure sector. And right now, we're in a classic situation that countries throughout Asia faced. So southern China wasn't developed before it started to get involved with this. The World Wide Web was laid through public-private partnerships through these sorts of banks and mechanisms, the physical infrastructure of it, the fiber optic cables, the cell networks, the container port retrofits around the world were put together with public-private partnerships that allowed ships to move. When the chip fabrication plants didn't move from Silicon Valley to East Asia because the labor cost was less, they moved because there was a heavy investment in the water and power infrastructure that made chip fabrication possible and made it less costly. So the location advantage of the United States benefits from investment in this multi-sector infrastructure bank that other places have benefited from. It also brings, and just say something about the financing and then move over to Robert. The benefit of the financing mechanism is essentially that it's about bringing an additional pot of capital to bear on the problem. Right? So right now, a large amount of money sits in pension funds. I think Tyler indicated it goes into East Asia, it goes into places that are often less attractive than the U.S. And it does so only because the U.S. hasn't figured out a way of anchoring this private capital, using it effectively in a way that syncs up with our public goals. And that's a challenge that we can address and meet. And I think we have to shift away from posing these things as, well, this makes it a non-starter, towards saying, well, this is an easier challenge to face than the idea that we're going to, within this deficit ceiling debate, increase dramatically the amount of money for infrastructure necessary to grow the pie sufficiently and to return to a situation where the U.S. exports more than it imports.
Thank you. Mr. Dove?
Good morning. My name is Robert Dove, and I am the co-head of the $1.2 billion Carlyle Infrastructure Fund, which was raised specifically to invest in infrastructure projects in the United States. I will join a long list of individuals who thank Bernard Schwartz for his contribution and commitment to public service. Bernard's legacy of success in the private sector and commitment and generosity in the public sector should be a template to all of us in business. I have been asked to comment as someone from the business sector on how a national infrastructure bank could work. However, as someone who manages risks for a living, I'm going to do something rather risky for a businessman and venture briefly into the world of public policy to comment on this country's infrastructure policy. It is essential to keep in mind that an infrastructure bank is only a means by which the United States would implement a policy that encourages and increases direct investment in rebuilding and expanding the nation's infrastructure. Before any discussion about a bank can begin, our nation's policymakers have to agree that it is essential to access private investment for public infrastructure. This ideally should be done in a genuine partnership between state and local governments and the private investment community. A good example of such a partnership, as Representative DeLauro knows, is the investment that our fund made through a partnership with the state of Connecticut to renovate and upgrade the 23 rest stops on the principal highways in Connecticut. This partnership shifts the risk of the renovation, both cost and schedule, to the private sector, yet allows for an ongoing sharing of revenues from the project with the state over the next 35 years, as well as creating new union jobs within the state. I make this point because the federal government must lead the way in rewarding innovation. States and local leaders around the nation are willing to form these partnerships, and that has not yet been done. The bank would be one manifestation of that federal leadership. Yet it is only a manifestation of a much deeper policy commitment to involve the private sector, which should be exemplified in several ways. This is a critical threshold issue because it involves important policy issues like performance standards in infrastructure projects, the management of risk, the integrity of data used to choose which projects to be funded, and several other issues that Congress and the administration must reform. Without these things being done, a national infrastructure bank would not only be unworkable, I submit that it would be harmful, as it would be providing projects to a system in which infrastructure financing policy is fatally flawed. So, how do I see the bank working? I think a good model is in fact that there is one in Europe, the European Investment Bank, better known as the EIB. Fundamentally, the EIB lends money or makes grants. This is an important point. It lends money or makes guarantees. It does not hand out grants. These loans and guarantees are expected to be repaid or extinguished. It lends money for a very long term, as much as 40 years, at very low rates of interest, and in doing so provides a level of subordinated capital that allows other participants, both banks and the private sector investors, to participate in a project that otherwise would be seen as unfundable. The lending policy of the EIB is driven by government, but the actual credit decisions on specific loans and guarantee proposals made to the bank are determined by professionals who come from a banking background or credit background and operate independently within the bank. Let me finish by underscoring an important point. There are significant private funds, including Carlyle's, looking to invest globally in infrastructure. The United States is competing for these funds with other countries that actually welcome private capital. The United Kingdom, Australia, Brazil, to name a few. Other governments have mechanisms and institutions that support public-private partnerships, both from a policy and a financing perspective. I have talked about one such institution being the EIB as a model for the National Infrastructure Bank in the United States. Everyone has agreed America's infrastructure is in bad shape and is in need of rebuilding. and virtually everybody agrees that there should be some way to leverage the private sector capital into the system to help accomplish this. Whilst this is not a silver bullet to solve America's infrastructure challenges, I do firmly believe that establishing a national infrastructure bank is a smart, much needed, and excellent first step. Thank you.
Mr. Schwenninger.
Thank you, Michael. While the others have focused a lot on the micro issues of how the bank would work, I'm going to talk briefly about how the bank would work to enhance our larger macro picture. I simply want to make 3 points. First, expanded infrastructure investment made possible in part by a bank would help us avoid, I think, a period. Okay, I will. A period of subpar economic growth, stag growth, if you will, which is often associated with economies suffering after a post-bubble burst, post-bubble economy. At the current pace of private sector deleveraging, we're still looking at 5 to 7 years of high unemployment. Currently, we have 25 million Americans who are either unemployed or underemployed. That number is going to stay very high for the next few years given current trends. Second, it's just not a matter of jobs. It's a matter that there's a lot of idle capital. We have a period of very weak capital formation because there's not much incentives for private investment at this period. There's a lot of money on corporate balance sheets. There's a lot of money in various funds waiting to be deployed, even with the global competition for capital. That capital will need to be put to work over the next 3 to 5 years if we're going to avoid stag growth. So the bank in this larger macro context can, with a relatively small amount of public capital, can put to work a much larger amount, as the other panelists noted, of private capital to support and finance growth-enhancing, growth-producing infrastructure projects that create jobs. We cannot overlook this fundamental challenge we face over the next 3 to 5 years to move from a growth rate of 1 to 2% to a growth rate of 3 to 4% at the very least. The second point I want to make is that the infrastructure bank can finance a particular part of the deficit that Brian outlined and that Tyler referred to. And this particular part of the infrastructure deficit has an outsized effect on economic growth and job creation, I would argue. These are infrastructure improvements and projects that tend to fall between the cracks of public and private. They tend to fall outside, even with some of the new Department of Transportation programs that Tyler mentioned. Many of them fall outside either of federal appropriations or other federal grant or loan programs, fall outside the municipal bond market. These are projects like modernization of our inland waterways, anything dealing with our air transportation shipment, anything dealing with freight and rail, anything dealing with energy transmission, particularly natural gas terminals and pipelines. All of these projects would have an outsized result or effect on jobs and growth. The third point I want to make, and it's probably the most controversial, is that the infrastructure bank will assist in easing the dilemma the United States faces in dealing with the debt overhang and the management of both the debt and the dollar in the period ahead. Not only for the reasons that Michael Likosky has alluded to, but for another reason. As a principal reserve currency economy of the dollar, and given the state of the European Union, the state of other potential currencies potential reserve currencies in the world, for the next 10 years, the United States is still going to have either the privilege or the burden of providing or generating liquidity and safe assets for the world. This inevitably means some kind of deficits. Now, the last decade, we provided a host of very unsafe assets in terms of mortgage-backed securities. So we need to handle this. So the debate is somewhat misleading now on fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation may be important for other reasons over a period of time, but one of the main challenges the United States has over the next, I would argue, 3 to 5 years or 5 to 7 years is that it needs to produce good investments, both for domestic and international capital, that also enhance, however, ones that also enhance the U.S. productive growth and economic strength. And this is where infrastructure investment is so key, because infrastructure investment in a bank can produce quality, credit-worthy investments that are attractive to domestic and international capital in 2 ways. One, either because the bank can issue its own capital, which is not the case with the bill, but is the case with some other models, or because it can provide loan guarantees for issuance of specific project bonds. It can satisfy and provide a huge it can satisfy a huge demand and a growing demand for quality fixed income investments over the next 3 to 5 years. There's 2 demographic trends that are currently underway. No, it's not Medicare and Social Security. There's 2 demographic trends that makes fixed income, a growth in the supply of fixed income investments very necessary. One is the fact is that the baby boom generation is now moving to a medium age of 57. They're moving from an investment strategy of risky equity investments to putting more money into fixed income that generates income at a safer risk. Therefore, we do not have those kinds of investment in sufficient supply for the next 3 to 5 years. The mortgage market has dried up. Treasuries will continue to yield very low levels of return. Second, infrastructure improvements will actually generate a number of other very positive investments that the U.S. can supply to the capital markets, because infrastructure investments, as others allude to, increase the efficiency of private capital, they enhance the value, they make possible other projects and investments. So a small amount of public infrastructure investment produces a multiplier effect of other investments, which will attract capital both domestic and internationally. And this is going to be the name of the game over the next 3 to 5 years, of whether the U.S. can provide good investments for both domestic and international investors. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherle. I want to get to the audience for questions as soon as possible, but let me throw 1 or 2 out there myself to begin with. Obviously, a theme here is, how this would really work, and let's drill down on that a little bit. Tyler referred to it, the problem of uncertainty. Michael was talking about a reputation here in this country for not doing public-private partnerships well, and indeed, to the extent that there is a great deal of ideological resistance here in Washington to such an idea, it is in part because of this. People think of what ended in disaster, the public-private partnership in housing, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Supporters of this idea, would point to other models. For example, the Export-Import Bank, which has been deemed largely successful. Robert mentioned the EIB as a model. let's talk about that a little bit. I'd be interested in knowing, for example, from Tyler or Michael, whether you think that should be the model, whether there is some other model, so that we can, in moving forward on an idea like this. I mean, frankly, this is a country that perceives the need for a successful model beyond where we've been in the last few years in the housing market. Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, the EIB definitely is kind of functioning well. I think the key element of that is kind of lost in the U.S. is the credibility of the institution to make these fact-based decisions. And the U.S. government, lots of governments in the U.S. Don't have a lot of credibility. I mean, all of the conversation about the bridge to nowhere and other major resource allocation failures have really depressed public confidence in the ability of government institutions to make these decisions. So one of the fundamental objectives should be to restore that and to really bring a fact base to these decisions. And whether it's EIB, frankly, I would say most of the rest of the world that makes major capital intensive investments through government entities has figured out a way to build credibility in that process. We just have been unsuccessful in the U.S. at doing that.
Michael?
I want to say maybe something about, I think we have a tradition of doing these right, too, particularly in the infrastructure and energy sector, both in the recent past couple of years somewhat, I'd say, but also the Roosevelt administration faced the same problem in 1937. There was a lot of public debt to get the first wave, and then they faced a double dip. And the idea was to embrace this model. Mariner Eccles, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said that unwise spending was spending for the other fellow. So it's exactly the approach we take to public spending right now. And what Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, Roosevelt did, they started to use these quasi-public entities. And our quasi-public entities were public-private partnerships. The purpose was they were, as Roosevelt said about them, they were public entities clothed with private clothes. So they had the adaptability of a private sector enterprise. Yeah. Sure. The quasi-public entities at their heyday were this. They were able to bring private capital to bear on public challenges, and they did so by recognizing that there had to be a public partner in the U.S. And I think that what we have had a trouble with in the last couple of years is recognizing that public-private partnerships need a public partner. And that, I think, we have to take more seriously. This is not going to be a coast to build infrastructure. There has to be some serious public partner, and the infrastructure bank is part of it. But the success, I'd say, of the EIB and the Asian Development Bank and the Ex-Im Bank is what they do is they catalyze a larger market. So not all projects that are public-private partnerships are going to need a national bank. But a national bank starts to shift towards creating incentives on the part of state agencies to do these projects that they can do on their own, largely, often. And that's the real goal, is not just to see this as just to see a national bank as a catalytic bank, not only for private investment, but also for starting to grow and have a different approach towards an economy that we have had at our points of rapid growth. And there have been challenges, but we've dealt with those challenges, and I think we can learn from those challenges as well in how we've done it domestically as well.
Robert, further thoughts?
I mean, I just want to make 2 points on that. One, it's important to understand that the policy of the EIB is not driven by the EIB. It's driven by the 27 governments which own the EIB. So if those governments decide that renewable energy is an important fact for the growth of the European economy, they will direct the EIB to look for projects in the renewable energy space, or in the high-speed rail space, or in the transportation space. Which projects get financed is not decided by the government, but is decided by the professionals who are inside the bank that do a rigorous credit analysis, come up with a scoring system, and make a recommendation to the investment committee and ultimately to the board, depending on the size of the project. That way, you get real credible projects financed, not projects which maybe would be beneficial to certain proponents of the project. The other thing is that the EIB, as I was trying to articulate, provides a level of capital which will make a project financeable by the private sector, which, if it was not there, would not be financeable. So just imagine you have a project, you imagine whatever you want, and if the person that was going to invest in the project knew that an institution was going to provide 40-year long-term capital at a very low rate of interest, then that would attract banks who would then put bank debt on top of it, and it would attract institutions like myself or CalPERS or other big pension funds that would then put in their capital as well. This is happening all over the world. It's not happening here, and it needs to happen.
And I'm just curious whether any of the panelists takes issue in any way with the specifics of the Kerry-Hutchinson legislation as it stands. I think the basic idea is, with an initial tranche of, say, $10 billion in public financing, you could leverage that up to better than $600 billion in private investment over the years. Does that seem workable under the terms of the legislation as it's put forward? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I'm definitely not commenting on a specific provision. I think the biggest challenge, though, is getting viable projects to market. I mean, the time frame and the complexity of bringing projects to market in the U.S. is a huge impediment to building anything new. So, I mean, I think in the near term, the recapitalization of the existing infrastructure, which requires a lot less complicated processes to get to a yes, is going to have to be a focus. So, I mean, people should expect that it will take a long time to ramp up kind of the new project component of this entity. But I do think there needs to be this needs to be part of this longer term conversation about why are our processes so difficult relative to other countries.
Okay. With that, let's open it up to the audience. Questions, please just raise your hand, and please make sure that there's a question mark at the end of whatever it is you say. Yes, sir. There's a microphone on its way over to you.
Thank you all for outlining some of the policy proposals and the pitfalls that could be there. This is a question, I guess, sort of specifically for you, Mr. Dove, since you've spoken to some of the specifics of running a bank such as this. You said that the governments involved in the EIB are able to set some of the policy direction of the projects they choose. It seems like having crumbling infrastructure and high unemployment are two things that should pretty much cancel each other out. You have an available workforce to do the projects if the projects are available. Would making the impact on unemployment a criteria for project selection be feasible? Would it be possible for a bank to look at something and say, X number, it will produce X number of man hours, need X number of resources produced by other companies? Would that be something that an infrastructure bank would be able to do?
I think that could well be part of the policy, that you're looking to improve employment. But I would just say that any infrastructure project funded either by the bank or by the private sector or by governments generates jobs. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why we need to get more infrastructure funding in this country, is it will create jobs. I mean, my little project in Connecticut, I'm not dismissing it, it's a tremendously good project and very important for the state of Connecticut. That did create nearly 100 new union jobs in that state. Would it have been done otherwise? Maybe, but I don't think so. So yes, I think it could be a criteria, but it shouldn't be the sole criteria.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. There seem to have been a few points made about national policy or lack thereof. Are we at this point, and this is the panel, I would like to see how they respond, are we at this point sufficiently advanced where we think there is enough of a debate that we can have as a start for a national policy to overcome the resistance that we have seen in this country to typically having infrastructure tied in with just the jobs but not the economic development directly at times? Second point, even in the Asian countries, China, India, and India, we have seen that infrastructure seems to have hit a hurdle in the second phase, wherein the pressure for land and other resources from the public has created resistance that some of the major projects have been stopped dead.
Thank you. Interesting question on the debate and whether resistance can be overcome.
I guess I'll start. And ASCE and some other groups hosted a summit a few weeks ago. And I think one of the things that came out of that discussion that we had was when we're trying to address this infrastructure problem and how we change the conversation, And I really think one of the things that came out of it was there was a study done recently. The Rockefeller Foundation commissioned a poll right after the State of the Union address, and it was fascinating in its results. At one point, at some point we could say the American public understands there's a problem. Somewhere around 70% of the people claim or agree that there's an infrastructure problem. And I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but in the high 70s that they say there's an infrastructure problem. The dilemma that we face is when they were posed solutions to some of those problems, and this was specifically on transportation, and ways in which to fund the solutions, some of them which are pretty well known. You could raise the gas tax, you could have a vehicle miles traveled tax, you could have increased tolling. Hands down, they rejected those by the same percentages, 70%, 65%. And I guess the dilemma that we face is educating the public that this stuff is not free. Our infrastructure is not free, and in fact, the fact that we haven't invested in it is costing each and every one of us money every single day, whether it's stuck in traffic, whether it's boil water alerts, whether it's flooding on the Mississippi River. These things do cost money, and I actually think at the end of the day, watching this and thinking a little bit more about this, what the American people really want is leadership on this issue and people to stand up, like the folks who've stood up and talked about the infrastructure bank and others, to stand up and say these are the solutions and we're going to solve this problem. And I think at that point, if we lay those things out and explain to folks how we solve the problems, then we can proceed. So that's a perspective.
Any other thoughts, Mike?
I just say that one of the first, we're dealing with huge challenges right now in D.C. and all around the country, right? From coming off of the war, from having a financial crisis, having to deal with deficits in the political environment. So I think that it's not these are hard challenges that we're facing, and this is part of a part of that package. I'd say one of the things that the advantage of introducing this proposal and public-private partnerships into the debate right now that makes them have more, I think are going to have more traction and have more resonance, is that these are approaches that are suited to dealing with solving how to bring money into infrastructure in the context of a deficit crisis. Our other solutions on the table simply aren't, right? They're discussions that we're used to having, and they haven't gone particularly well. So the idea of bringing an additional pot of private capital to bear on the problem without the public debt taking involved, while the public can delever their balance sheets, provides a solution that's being posed in a very concrete terms right now around the deficit debate. So I think that's one of the reasons why this proposal is one that's a little bit, that has some there's some payoff and is a little bit more addressed to the problem that we're posing right now as a society.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I think we're getting close to a policy consensus. We're a long way off from a political consensus, and I think as a result we need a lot more experimentation. I mean, right now there just aren't enough on-the-ground experiments where people can feel comfortable that the data, we have not translated yet from a rhetorical versus data fight. We're still in the rhetoric versus rhetoric fight. That's kind of the early stages of policy progression, and I think we just need more on-the-ground experiments. And I think one of the great powers of any entity that finances infrastructure projects is they can provide evidence. We just don't have enough real-world evidence. We do around the world, but Americans tend to dismiss other countries' experiences in these areas.
Yes, sir.
John Nelson with Wall Street Without Walls. One particular model might be the UK, the Social Investment Bank. Sir Ronald Cohen, who serves on our advisory board, who utilized underutilized assets held by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, abandoned bank accounts, for example, as credit enhancements. We have vacant lots. We have all kinds of underutilized federal and state and city assets that could be used as extra collateral for the bank. Do you see this kind of model adding on underutilized collateral as a way of helping to finance through a structured finance mechanism some of the infrastructure bank ideas?
I think that is an interesting idea. Remember, in the UK, you have central government and central treasury functions. So the city of Birmingham really can't do anything. This is the city of Birmingham in the UK, can't do anything, whereas the city of Birmingham in Alabama has a lot more power than the city of Birmingham in the UK. So that central government role actually does allow for things that you're talking about happening. I can tell you that in the UK right now, the fiscal problems are dire. And one of the things which is happening is that the central government is telling municipalities, if you own infrastructure assets, you should sell them and get money from the private sector or enter into some partnerships. So you'll find that regional airports or car parking or whatever it is will be coming on the block, and there will be an opportunity for me to invest in that. Whereas I'd like to try and invest in that same situation here in the United States.
Cheryl?
Yeah, I want to underscore one of the points that Robert Dove made in his presentation, because I want to underscore one of the points that Robert Dove made in his presentation, because I think it points to the model that the Kerry Hutchinson bill moves towards, and that will work in the American context. As I understand it, there's large number of private funds that have been accumulated over the last 3 to 5 years to invest in the next big thing in terms of the infrastructure boom. But many of these projects actually do require some public sector participation of one kind or another. I see a lot of low-hanging fruit out there for projects that are just waiting for the kind of public sector loan guarantees or participations that the Build Act or other versions would put forward, that actually do, whether it's modernization of inland waterways that have immediate fees and returns attached to them, or the kind of projects that Robert talked about. So there is an American model out there and waiting that I think actually has enough practical experience. What has been missing is this fairly modest but yet very powerful impact of having this public sector entity of unleashing some of all that money that Robert Dove and others are sitting on.
We'll take a few more questions while we're waiting for Senator Kerry. The gentleman here, the white-haired gentleman right here.
I'm Charles Hoke with the white hair. Thank you. With white hair comes wisdom, but I don't claim it. I was particularly interested in the responses of all 5 gentlemen. I guess we are all interested in Mr. Dove's pot of money, just alluded to. I am a Virginian by rearing. Your reference to the project in Connecticut, and you mentioned, I think 3 times, I sort of recollected, the making or the creation of union jobs. I mentioned my heritage as a Virginian because we are right to work in Virginia, and we are wondering if, I would wonder, not we, I would wonder if projects criteria for the Carlyle Group would impose union membership for any project that you would underwrite. Thank you.
Our investment policy does not specifically say that we need to create union jobs. It doesn't say that we need to create any jobs. But I would like to make it very clear that on 2 things. One, you would be surprised to know, and I cannot, for confidentiality reasons, reveal who they are, but we have several union pension funds actually invested in our fund because they want to see their workers' money going into infrastructure projects. Secondly, we have a policy whereby we recognize unions and we support the right for unions to work, and we do not go out of our way one way or another. The important thing for me is to find good projects with good returns for my investors.
Well, thank you so much. I see Senator Kerry is here. So with that, we will end the first phase of the program. Thanks so much to a wonderful panel.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank Michael Hirsh. Thank you all very much for joining us.